Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second round of the Historic Preservation Design Guidelines presentation. In this presentation, I'll be outlining the second half of the proposed new document, whereas on the first meeting, I did the first half of the document. Um, so the purpose of the guidelines is it's a technical guide which outlines the recommended procedures and methods to preserve historic architecture and streetscapes in the city of Harrisburg, primarily aimed towards the municipal historic districts in the city. We are updating the existing guidelines because um, the existing guidelines were developed in 2009, and we feel that it's time to update them to add more comprehensive information, add more detailed information about methods of historic preservation, why historic preservation is important, and additional information that we feel that the existing guidelines don't have. So I'll get right into it. And thanks for being here. I will share my screen. And I will start off where I left off the last meeting. So this chapter is chapter 5, rehabilitation of existing infrastructure and existing historic buildings. And then each of these sub-chapters is a section within this chapter. And it was somewhat difficult to try to format this document to make it easy to consume, and nonetheless it's a long, lengthy process to try to make it as easy as possible but as comprehensive as it can be without being too cumbersome. Fences and walls, and decorative or privacy walls are common features in Harrisburg's historic districts. They are used as both aesthetic and functional purposes, such as delineating property lines, creating privacy, and having an architectural visual buffer around a property or a garden. The most common materials for fencing are wood, masonry, and often ornamental metal, such as wrought or cast iron, which is pictured right here. That's the most common kind of historic fence that we tend to think about when we think of historic fencing. Notice how ornate this fence is with the corn husks on the top and the ornate cast ornamental work within it. The preservation of historic fencing and masonry walls is important to preserve the integrity of a property and the integrity of the fence itself. Basic maintenance such as paint, scraping of paint, ensuring that there is no rust or deterioration of the material, particularly metal and or wood. New fence considerations are important. The HARB, the Architectural Review Board, often reviews fences. It's a common request in historic districts. Usually fences are granted approval based on the context of the setting of the fence, the material of the fence, the height of the fence, whether or not the zoning code approves of the height of the fence in that particular zoning district. So there are quite a few considerations, but overall, as long as it is an appropriate design that fits in with the character of the neighborhood, it's usually not an issue. Moving on to historic paints, this small section is primarily based on the caution of being aware of lead paint in historic buildings and historic places. Lead paint was used up until 1978 and is essentially in almost every single historic building in the city and elsewhere throughout the country. Lead was used in all types of paint, and obviously lead is hazardous to our health, and it's important that the public and those working to remediate lead are aware that it is present in most historic buildings. So this chapter is just a cautionary cautionary chapter that explains the presence of lead in historic paints, and it gives resources to be able to mitigate and identify lead. Furthermore, and this section also includes painting of historic buildings. So this is primarily geared towards the purpose of paint, the application of paint to historic materials and buildings. Paint on historic buildings has two primary functions. First, it's a protective coating, of course, that protects primarily wood, metal, and other materials from deterioration. And secondly, it's an aesthetic coating to convey color or a mural even. So, so it has two very important roles in conveying, you know, the historic architecture in our historic districts. The color of paint is not regulated by the historic district ordinance. So essentially, color painting of already painted materials is appropriate, and they can be painted any color. The painting of masonry is typically not appropriate, with some exceptions if the masonry was historically painted or was already painted in the past, or if of course, as we see pictured here, or if a mural was approved by the HARB. Obviously, we have to balance historic preservation and community building and tourism. So it's important to allow murals on, you know, some vacant masonry walls that aren't, I suppose, contributing to the historic district, but it's important to have public art and historic preservation together. The next section is accessibility. So accessibility of historic buildings is important to ensure that all people are able to enjoy historic buildings in our historic districts. Improving accessibility into historic buildings has a great benefit to you know, those who desire to use them, who need to use them, and it allows for inclusion of all people that require access to these historic buildings. Usually ramps are the most common feature or proposal that for historic buildings, but we also get requests for lifts and so on. So it's important that these ramps and lifts are integrated into the architecture of the building in a way that is not intrusive or has an adverse effect on the character of the streetscape. As you can see here, this ramp blends in nicely with the existing building, as it is simple, but it matches the character of the building itself, and it is blends in nicely with the environment that it is in. And this goes on to talk about the different types of hardware and entrances and what requires HARB approval and can be administratively approved. Overall, HARB needs to review ramps, lifts, big ticket items. Sometimes hardware and things like that can be administratively approved depending on the context of the alteration. Moving on to the next chapter. So this is chapter 6, additions to historic buildings. So new additions can be acceptable to historic buildings if they're absolutely necessary if they're absolutely necessary and their design is carefully considered. It's important that the addition is architecturally compatible with the historic building and its surrounding environment. The new addition should be differentiated so that a false historical appearance is not created. So it's important that the addition is different than the historic building, but not so different that it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's important to have continuity between materials and design with the historic building. Additions that, if removed in the future, should allow the essential form and integrity of the existing building to remain. Additions are viewed very closely by the HARB because additions can have a very large impact on the integrity of the building and the integrity, the historical integrity and the architectural integrity of the neighborhood. The big idea around additions is the relationship between the addition and the existing building. As you can see here, here's a small addition on the Hickok Mansion on Front Street. This was recently done, and it's compatible through the type of material that it's used. The masonry matches the water course, the water table course on the basement level of the Hickok Mansion. It's obviously differentiated. No one's going to assume that this is a historic structure, but it also is secondary to the mansion, but it blends in with the environment. So then the next chapter is new construction in historic districts. So I wanted to say these chapters haven't changed a whole lot. You know, it's difficult to have hard and fast rules for additions and new construction projects in historic districts because it largely depends upon the context of where it's being built, how it's being built, what the architecture of the existing building is, and things like that. So new additions and new construction kind of have a lot of the same considerations in terms of architectural considerations and otherwise. So new construction can make a positive impact on the historic district, but to be successful, the new architecture, like I said, with additions, must be sympathetic to the existing historic buildings surrounding it. Essentially, the context of the historic district must be taken into account with the new design. New construction designs should be inspired by surrounding buildings and historic architecture of the surrounding neighborhood. This contextualism is achieved through massing, scale, materials, and site design of the new building. New construction must blend in with the built environment and shall not be an intrusion on the historic district. The HARB reviews all new construction in the municipal historic district for this reason. Even though they are new buildings, they should not detract from the general historic character of the neighborhood. So as you can see here, here's an example of new, I say new, relative to the neighborhood, new construction in Shipoke. These buildings were actually constructed, I want to say the early 80s. So these are fairly compatible with the historic neighborhood in terms of scaling, massing, materials. You know, a lot of these considerations were thought of when these were being constructed. So the big issue, or the big consideration to understand with new construction, is the compatibility versus differentiation. So I thought it was important to include this into the guidelines as a concept, because this is a concept that's understood in historic preservation when doing new construction in a historic neighborhood. So compatibility is closer to is just what it is, compatible with the existing architecture and materials, whereas differentiation is just as it is, it's intentionally opposed to the historic neighborhood. So here's a little scale: replication, imitation, and referenced. Usually I think it's more important that the new construction is more compatible than differentiated with the historic neighborhood, because that's the goal of historic preservation, is maintaining the character of the existing neighborhoods. So compatibility is weighed more heavily than differentiation, but it is important to differentiate new construction. As you can see here, these new infill row homes have these garden windows on the front. And these are very popular when these were constructed. And there are some other architectural features that these would not necessarily be misinterpreted as being historic. Whereas this building is intentionally differentiated in Uptown, is obviously an obvious attempt to oppose local historic architecture and to oppose the local neighborhoods architectural continuity and historic continuity. So the top picture is recommended, whereas the bottom picture is not recommended. So this concept is important to understand for developers and others who are looking to have a new construction project in historic district. Chapter 8, demolition in historic districts. So demolition in historic districts do occur. They're not super common, but they do occur. And, it's important to preserve as much as we can, but at some point, some buildings have been damaged or have severe neglect to the point where they're not economically feasible, or they're have already begun to collapse. It's important to identify the economic feasibility and the being realistic about whether a building can be saved or not. And this goes with the context of the building, where it's at, what will replace it. And that's the next big thing is if a building is to be slated for demolition by individual in front of HARB, it has to be guaranteed. There has to be a guarantee for appropriate new construction on that site. And this was an ordinance passed by the city of Harrisburg in 2008 to guarantee new construction on the site of where a historic building was demolished in a municipal historic district. And there are demolition criteria. This chapter is largely the same as the existing. I tried to make it a little easier to digest, but overall, demolition considerations are essentially the same as the existing guidelines. The existing condition of the structure, is the structure architecturally or historically significant to trends in local, state, or American history, or is that building associated with a significant person or event, or is it registered is it listed on the National Register? Is the structure a design intrusion? Was the building itself not contributing to the historic district? And so on. So there's a lot of a lot of considerations to understand when evaluating whether or not demolition is an appropriate response to a derelict building in a historic district. And context always matters. You'll hear me say that a million times. Context is very essential to interpreting and understanding the appropriateness of an action in a historic district. What's the integrity of the block? What's the integrity of the district? Have there been other intrusions in the area, and so forth? So it's hard to develop hard and fast rules for demolition, new construction, new infill, additions. It's all dependent upon the project itself and the location of the project. Moving on to Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is an entirely new chapter in the new draft of the Historic District Guidelines. And this goes back to the idea of context. So Chapter 9 is building, site, and setting. While much of the focus of historic preservation is focused on primary buildings and structures, the existing relationships between historic features, settings, and buildings is what makes historic neighborhoods special places. Associated outbuildings, sidewalks, gardens, and mature trees are all contributing features of historic properties. These relationships and associations all play a part in creating the cultural landscape of a historic streetscape. The maintenance and preservation of a building site is an important task to ensure the integrity of the landscape and its contribution to the built environment. When planning a project that may impact the building site and exterior relationships, consider the impact the project will have on the setting, feeling, and association of the historic building. Secondary buildings. Secondary buildings can be included with the rest of the guidelines. All the same methods and procedures will apply, but I thought it was necessary to add secondary buildings in because a lot of, a lot of individuals feel that or assume that secondary buildings such as garages and sheds and other historic buildings aren't under the purview of HARB, where in fact they are if they're visible from a public right-of-way. So it's important to preserve the secondary or ancillary buildings to a primary structure, because that relationship that relationship between those buildings convey a lot of information of how that property was used, what it was used for. So there's a lot of information and historical value to maintaining other secondary buildings on a property. Landscaping and hardscaping. So landscaping and hardscaping is extremely important in terms of the setting of a historic district. Mature trees, mature shrubs, and patios, sidewalks, things like that, all contribute to the feeling of a historic setting. So it's important to maintain these features. And although landscaping isn't particularly under the purview of HARB, it's important to identify that some historic gardens exist on a property, and it's important to identify that these too are cultural resources and that they should be preserved just as the building should be. So not in all cases, historic gardens aren't super prevalent everywhere, but think about like the sunken gardens on Riverfront Park. That's a cultural resource, and that has been maintained and preserved and throughout for almost a century. So it's important to identify that landscaping has a big impact on and the species that are planted in a historic district. It's important to try to plant as many native species as possible, and so on. And furthermore, most hardscaping projects do require a review by the HARB, depending on how impactful they are, their location, their visibility. So if they're visible from a public right-of-way, they would, of course, require a review by the Architectural Review Board. Street trees. So street trees, like I was saying about trees in landscaping, street trees are great assets to a historic streetscape. There are many positive benefits, including stormwater runoff benefits. It slows down traffic. It provides an appealing and an aesthetic quality to a historic district. So there are innumerable benefits to a neighborhood when there are street trees. But it's important that these street trees are properly maintained, which if they are a street tree, it's the city has to maintain them. And we do have the city does have a city arborist. So so she's been a great asset to the city and its residents. Parking lots and impervious surfaces. So parking lots can be seen as intrusions on a historic district. They can be poorly designed, or they can be designed. They can be a good design. So it all depends on like I said, it all depends on the context. But overall, parking lots have a negative effect on historic districts because it increases, stormwater runoff, heat island effect, and other, negative impacts on the historic district. So, but the installation of a parking lot or another impervious surface usually requires hard review if visible from a public right-of-way. Historic features. Historic features should be preserved. Here's a photo of a boot scraper. There are quite a few of these in the city. Uh, if you don't notice them, you kind of just walk by them and kind of forget about it. But these things like these should be preserved because these convey a story and how people lived in Harrisburg in the past. So you'll see these around if you take a notice. And these are a relic of when Harrisburg's streets were just soil, really. So it's kind of interesting to think about that. And interpretive signs and markers. These are important for public history, for tourism for the city, as well as just residents learning about local history. So it's important to have these as long as they're appropriate and as long as they're minimally impactful, but also usable. The historic markers from PHMC and the National Register of Historic Places are appropriate, as well as HSA preservation awards. So these are minimally invasive as long as they're mounted correctly, and they add character and they add a narrative to the historic district. And the last part of this section is climate change and flooding. So as you could see here, here's a photo of South 2nd Street in June of 1972 during Tropical Storm Agnes, and its record-breaking flooding of the city and quite frankly the state. So it's important that residents of historic districts and throughout the city are aware that the city has a long and intimate history with flooding. So it's important to know where your property is, whether and what its probability of flooding is. So it's very important to prepare for a flooding event in the future as climate change intensifies and storms become more severe. So 1936, 1972, and even just recently in 2011 were big flood events in the city. So it's important that residents of historic districts and otherwise are aware of the risk of flooding from the Susquehanna and Paxton Creek corridor. Chapter 10, utilities and mechanical equipment. So obviously, to adaptively reuse historic buildings, they need to be upgraded and modified for 21st century utilities and living, and to make them practical. So equipment and devices such as heat pumps, ventilation louvers, registers, fans, alarms, cable boxes, utility meters, satellite dishes, and security cameras should be mounted on secondary facades if possible, kind of tucked away, but sometimes this isn't possible. So if a condenser or a heat pump is visible from a public right-of-way, usually sometimes it depends on the context. Sometimes they have to be reviewed by HARB depending on the location of it and how visible it is, and if one's existing already. So it's kind of, but usually it requires HARB review if it has an adverse effect on the visual aesthetic of a building or the historic district. Gas meters and regulators. So this has been a sticky issue in historic preservation for quite some time. Utility companies such as PP&L are required to notify those living in a historic district, local or national, that they have the ability to relocate meters inside of the building in the basement, but the regulators have to be on the exterior. So that's a whole nother issue, but it's important to know that historic district property owners do have rights when it comes to the installation of regulator or meters, rather, not the regulator. So, and like I said, this has been a sticky issue, but of course, these always come up as an issue in historic preservation. Um, Window air conditioners, it's important that they're attempted to be mounted on secondary facades, and it's important that they're not permanently installed into a window opening or another fenestration. Window sashes shouldn't be removed to install them or anything like that. But it's also important when they are utilized that they're properly installed so that they, don't fall out of a window and potentially hurt somebody. Satellite dishes. As you could see here on this historic streetscape, you could see quite a few satellite dishes mounted on the front of the house. These are removable and they don't have necessarily a permanent damage to the building, but they do have an adverse visual effect to the neighborhood. So it's important to try to mount these on, the roof or the rear of the house or something like that. To minimize the impact that these have on the historic district. Chapter 11, energy efficiency. So energy efficiency and historic preservation kind of go hand in hand. Historic preservation is essentially a giant recycling program for buildings. Nothing is more environmentally sustainable than continuing to use and maintain existing buildings. The encompassed energy and resources that historic buildings hold are tremendous, and not to mention the intrinsic value they provide to our community through beautiful historic architecture and their economic value. And the primary issue that comes up with energy efficiency is windows and doors. So historic windows and doors are easily targeted by homeowners and by window contractors that they're inefficient and they're drafty, which can be the case a lot of the time. Poor maintenance of window systems can cause them to be drafty and inefficient. But it's important that if properly maintained, historic windows and doors can be energy efficient. And if they're retrofitted with storm windows, they can also be energy efficient. But to replace historic windows and doors, the embodied energy that it takes to manufacture new windows, to ship new windows, to install new windows. Think about all the fossil fuel that it takes to create that process, whereas the existing windows already exist and that embodied energy was already expended to have those there. So it's important to understand the cost, the total environmental cost of replacement comparatively to the cost of repair and retrofitting of historic windows and doors. Solar panels and renewable energy. So I'm a big fan of solar panels and renewable energy, and it's important to ensure that these historic preservation and the conservation of resources continues to be a hand in a glove. So the implementation of solar panels is, has been a kind of a sticky subject in historic preservation. But it's important that we allow the use of solar panels, but they also can't be so visually obstructive to the historic district that they diminish the historic character of the historic district. So usually solar panels are installed on like flat roofs, on a gable roof on the back of it that's only visible from like a secondary road or something like that. So again, context matters when planning or attempting to plan the installation of solar panels. So I included architectural salvage as part of energy efficiency. kind of the theme of, conserving materials and things like that. So a lot of historic architectural features can be found in architectural salvage yards or warehouses. There are quite a few in Pennsylvania. The closest one is in York. It's I believe it's called the Refinings. So Refinings in York has shutters, doors, windows, other architectural features, posts, corbels, brackets, spindles, balusters. They have a lot of architectural features, and there are quite a few other architectural warehouses in Pennsylvania that are good resources for those who have a shutter that's missing, or have one or two features that are missing. Usually it's tough to try to go to architectural salvage yards and find like a whole set of brackets or something. That sometimes is possible, but it's tricky, because usually people they only acquire a couple of a unit. So architectural warehouses are a good resource for those interested in historic preservation, or just want to learn more about historic materials. It's kind of a flea market for historic architectural features. And lastly, historic preservation organization. So this is the last kind of section of the document that just outlines local and state historic preservation organizations that always work with the city and the planning bureau for all kinds of issues, grants, historic preservation, and planning as a whole. So these organizations are other resources that can be used and trusted for historic preservation matters. And that is the end of the draft document. Scrolling through this, I noticed a couple things that I missed or have changed, and that's why it's a draft. But I would like to acknowledge Councilwoman Bowers, if she would like to add anything, and I will acknowledge her if she would like to speak.
Frank, I believe Councilwoman Bowers, she just had to leave. I see a message from her due to another meeting, so she apologizes for that.
Oh, no worries. Thanks for the update, Momin. So I will open up the floor for public discussion or public questions. Does anyone have any questions?
For anyone who has a question, please raise your hand. Use the raise hand feature in the Zoom app there, and we'll call it up one at a time. I see David's hand is raised, so you should be able to unmute yourself.
Another excellent presentation, Frank. David Morrison here. And thank you, Momin, for your help as always. Couple of things. One very minor correction, but just on that last page there where you had the resources, Historic Harrisburg's website is now .org, not .com. We changed that a couple months ago. But I had a question. You mentioned about street trees. Maintenance is the city's responsibility. There's an awful lot of misunderstanding and confusion over that, because I've been told many times that it's the homeowner's responsibility. It's the city's jurisdiction in terms of what can and can't be done to a street tree. But could you elaborate on what exactly the rules are?
Yeah, I'll try. And like you, sometimes I get confused. Obviously, I'm not all up to date with the regulations on street trees, but I believe that the city has purview over the maintenance and care of street trees. But I also feel that homeowners can maintain those trees as well. So again, I'm not exactly sure. You know, I'm sorry that I'm not super helpful in answering that question.
I've had a call into the city arborist to kind of try to get a better handle on that. And when I am successful in speaking with her, Historic Harrisburg, at least for starters, will try to share what we learn on Facebook or one of our broadcast emails or something, because we do get inquiries from time to time from people that aren't sure what they're allowed to do, or whether it's their job to keep a tree properly trimmed, or whether it's their job to restore a sidewalk that has buckled because the roots have caused the sidewalk to buckle. Those are a lot of the issues. So we will look into that.
Yeah, those are good questions. I don't want to give any wrong answers. So I won't, speak too much on that, but, I think it's important that, both homeowners and the city and neighbors, kind of collaborate together, so,
Yep.
I mean, communication is key. So I feel that if there's an issue with a tree and it's an obvious hazard, I feel that, neighbors should have the ability to maintain that tree collectively. But ultimately, the street trees are city property, I believe. So that's kind of a sticky situation that I'm not too positive on, that I'd like to also learn more about. So yeah, if I come up with any more definitive answers, I'll definitely reach out.
Great, thanks. And third question, Frank, earlier in your presentation tonight, you had the example of the sore thumb addition, which was a large, very tall, gray, boxy addition to a peaked roof, 2.5-story house. Now, were you referring to that as a good example of an addition that was deliberately non-compatible, or an example of something that was incompatible in a negative way? I wasn't quite sure. Do you remember?
Yeah. So additions are tricky. That particular addition, in my opinion, is not compatible.
Okay.
I
thought when you showed it.
Yeah, that particular addition doesn't have any of the same materials of the existing historic structure. It doesn't share the same type of form. Usually with the additions on historic buildings, I feel that the materials and form should match the existing building, but the differentiation should come in window types or decorative features. So I feel, in my opinion, that is not a compatible addition. But then again, that's just my opinion.
Well, most of what you've said tonight, the vast majority of what you've said is certainly stuff that I and Historic Harrisburg concur with. So many of these things can always be open to another opinion, but by and large, I think everything was right on target. And just finally, on that same score, that one property that you showed in Uptown Harrisburg, I think maybe at Penn and I don't know what it might have been, Peffer or Geiger Street, almost up the way. That project, I think, occurred way before the old Uptown Historic District was established, and way before any wave of restoration swept through that neighborhood. And I think 40 years ago, that was kind of the trend was to be very sacrilegious in non-conforming architecture.
Yeah.
So in a way, that's almost a historic case in itself by now. But it does, for your presentation, it does give a good example of something. Yeah. And I think that's actually a remodel of the corner row house of that block. And then the next row house in is gone, and then there's two to the left in that picture that are still in their traditional appearance.
That's
So,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. The same case could be said for City Hall itself. You know, the brutalist architecture of the 70s and 80s. You know, a lot of people, it's a love-hate kind of relationship. A lot of people hate that style of architecture for its kind of radical form and design, but a lot of people like it. You know, so it's tough. It's tough. Like I always say, it's tough to have hard and fast rules for new construction and new additions, because you know it's all it's at the end of the day, it's subjective. It's hard to be completely objective, and that's why we have guidelines to try to eliminate the subjectiveness of decisions by Harb and otherwise. So yeah, these discussions definitely are very helpful in identifying this delineation between objectivity and subjectivity and historic preservation.
Well said. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Trina Gribble. Go ahead, Trina.
Yes, hi. Hi, Frank. Hi, David. Hi, everybody. This is Trina Gribble. I'm the chair of the Harb, and just wanted to make a couple comments. Again, thank you, Frank, for your presentation and for putting the document together based on some edits that the board had and plenty of your own. I wanted to talk about windows. Obviously, that's one of the key subjects that comes across to the board, and also a controversial one. The thing about Harb is we want to maintain the historic fabric of our city. And there's a lot of talent that went into the craftsmanship to put these buildings together. And craftsmanship has been dying out in recent years. The typical craftsman you had 50, 100 years ago, just they're not in the same quantities that they used to be. So with windows, we're confronted with the same problem, though, that we don't have craftsmen who can repair the windows. So it seems like the low-hanging fruit is to replace them. But I do agree with you, and I do completely agree with you about the embodied energy that's already existing in the existing windows, and to replace with new, you're spending more energy. But also, I would ask homeowners to consider the financial implications. I know windows are very expensive, but also the energy that they're saving is not as high as you might think. The payback period for window replacement is many, 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 many years. I'd say 50 years or so. Mm-hmm. So to consider a repair of window, it would be probably a less expensive option, and also more energy efficient, and actually therefore the payback will be sooner since it's financially cheaper. So I just wanted to add that to the mix. Also, utilities, I'm glad to see that that's made it into the document a bit stronger from before. And I really am glad to see that we talked about like gas meters and their location. That's something that we've been trying to communicate, that is not, we are not at the mercy completely of the utilities. Mm-hmm. That can be located in a more discrete location, and it can be negotiated and coordinated with the utility. It's not that many of the workforce that you see out your front porch, they'll just say, this is where we typically put it, that's where we're going to put it. But you really do have more rights than that as to where that meter is going to go. So again, I'm glad that that's included in the document. So that's what I have for now. So look forward to everybody's comments as we go forward and making this a final document. Thank you.
Thanks, Trina.
All right, I did see a hand raised earlier, but their question may be answered because I don't see their hand anymore. At this time, if there's anyone else that would have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. All right, I don't see any hands raised.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming and listening to the presentation and commenting. Again, the draft document is available for download on the city's website and also in the chat box right in this meeting. If you have any questions or comments or concerns that you didn't feel comfortable with voicing them here, you can feel free to contact me at the Planning Bureau at 255-3079 or my email fagrumBine@harrisburgpa.gov. Thank you for attending and have a lovely evening.